It's always great coming to talk with Aziza. She's a fantastic speaker and lover of the arts, and so she always brings together very interesting people, and I look forward to saying hi. Sorry for this cold, I should have said hi before. Topher and I are friends, but we're also colleagues. We were trained, I guess, through different paths, but we met at the Canadian Opera Company. I was an assistant director, and Topher was a resident artist in their ensemble company. I'm not sure if you've heard of that program where they train young singers, pianists, and at the time they had trained directors to stage directors to work through the company. You're given 2 years to then you're birthed into different experiences across the world. That's where Topher and I met. Personally, as an artist, I freelance as a stage director, so I go about trying to get individual contracts with different companies across Canada, US, across into Europe, where opera seems to be more of a thriving thing because it was just part of their, I guess, upbringing. If I said to you, how many of you had seen an opera before 18? Anyone? Oh, some of you? Okay. Studied it? Yeah. In high school, I only saw one opera, which was La Bohème on a...
Phantom of the Opera?
The what?
Phantom of the Opera?
Not really. There's opera in that, but yeah. We only saw one La Bohème, and it was on a Laserdisc, the giant CDs. And that was it. And that was only because I was in OAC music. If I hadn't taken music, it wouldn't have happened as well. So again, my experience wasn't very... I was into sports and playing music, but not necessarily opera. I think what Aziza mentioned, there seems to be problems as I've graduated through different programs. You apply for grants through Toronto Arts Council, Canada Arts Council, and the Ontario Arts Council, 3 different city, provincial government. And individual artists can apply for individual grants. You can also apply against the Grain Theatre, which Topher and I work for. We've also applied for project grants. We do about 2 projects a year through Against the Grain Theatre. We're in our 5th year, and we have received funding from both Toronto Arts Council, Ontario Arts Council, and Canada Arts Council. It's not guaranteed every time, and you have to apply, and there's a whole process every time it kind of happens, and sometimes you get them, which is fantastic, and sometimes you don't. And that's kind of difficult when you kind of plan your season, because it's hard to think ahead, which is what we're always trying to do, but when you're only on a 1-year cycle, it makes it very difficult. You don't know when funding's going to happen. Again, that's also Organization Against Grain Theatre. Joel, as an individual, I've applied for individual projects as well. So there seems to be just a growing thing. As Aziza mentioned, Toronto is a great city. It is an art city, and I've found that it's fueled by its individuals. There are great institutions, TIFF, there's a Canadian Opera Company, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, that are leading the way, but it's also fueled, I think, by the passions of individuals who are desperately trying to make a career out of being an artist. I'm very fortunate throughout, after university, I haven't had to get a second job to substitute income. I've been able to work in opera and classical music since then, which is fantastic, but that's not the case for every artist. I think part of it, as Canadians, is the shift in our minds of art as entertainment and art as culture. Art is part of who we are. Again, we have a wonderful orchestra in our city, and do you call that your orchestra, or is it something that maybe you go to once every 3 years? I find that every time I go to the Toronto Symphony, it's becoming more and more ingrained into my fabric. It's something that I feel like I want to support. It's a great alternative to the endless restaurants on King West and the endless sort of drinks that one can have. That's sort of there all the time, but that's what's easy as well, and that's what's very difficult in this city to fight and get away from as well. As Aziza mentioned, I think Canada personally as well is going through a growth. As an artist, I've personally encountered very conservative obstacles that can get in my way, whereas in Europe, I've worked sometime in Germany, in Norway, and the freedom of what is accepted and what is done is just kind of mind-blowing as a Canadian. And it's until you get into those environments and can start to think outside the box, and that's kind of what we go by. With Against the Grain, we're not trying to say, hey, establishment, F you. I didn't want to swear. I wanted to, Aziza, but I wanted to keep this podcast somewhat PG. Instead of saying that, it's kind of just how do we take what we have and think outside the box. And whether you're an artist or not, we'll find out when I say hello to you. But again, what does playing the piano at a young age, how does that influence how you think as a doctor or as a lawyer, or how can you be creative and attack things differently, and how can you stand out as a lawyer from the rest of the many, many lawyers that there are? And that's what I believe the arts can do. It's still fairly conservative and still gripping past hopes and reservations. And I think it's not until our future leaders, and that's where Canada is sort of turning a corner. I met a lot of my sort of mentors and people who were in the current establishment who didn't have the same opportunities that are present to Canadians now. A lot of them had to go to Europe and work in opera houses and train in Paris and Germany and Berlin and all these different places, whereas now Canada is a prime place where Topher, who is just over 30, is the resident conductor at Calgary Opera, whereas that position would not have been there 20 years ago. And that's where I think the key is going forward, is somehow finding encouragement, support, and that means financial support as well, for the young leaders, and to find the rest. There are more out there. It's how do we develop them, how do we train them, and how do we mentor them? Being an opera director is a very cutthroat business. You wouldn't think it, but it is kind of that way, and everyone is out for their own kind of piece of the pie, and the pie is not very big. And so everyone just wants mine, 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 and screw you. Whereas how do you then foster that opportunity to kind of share the pie and then say, do you want some ice cream with that too? I'll put some ice cream on your plate. And that would be tasty, right? So that's sort of how that is. The other big thing that comes with that, I find, is failure. And failure is something that I can't be afraid of. And it's just hard in Canada, because once you fail once, it's really hard to be given a second chance. And that's the biggest curve, is the ability to give someone the chance to fail and then say, what did we learn from that? And now let's fix on it the next time. So that's something that me, as I'm a young arts leader in this city, province, and country, that I'm looking to give other opportunities to individuals the chance to succeed and to fail, and say, nah, what can we learn from that, and how do we then affect change in our city going forward? It's Toronto, as Aziza said as well, we're not trying to be London, we're not trying to be Berlin, we're not trying to be New York, we're Toronto, and Toronto has to have its own flavor and not have this complexity of we're not these other things, but who are we, and how do we own, and sort of what does it mean to be Canadian, what does it mean to be a Torontonian, and that's sort of what I'm embracing in my art. And through the projects that Aziza mentioned, I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how that can expand both for me and then for our company. So we have a show coming up, which I think Topher's going to talk a little bit about as well, June 2nd to 5th. And it's kind of fascinating to see, we started from scratch in 2011 when it was not a great time to start an arts company, because everything was just getting tighter, economy, money. But we found success in being kind of conservative, but we're just kind of looking to blow the top off the roof and sort of stay intimate, which is what Salon seems to be, which is fantastic, because you can actually see people and put faces to names. So that's what we're about. If you want to get on Twitter quickly to find out who we are, Facebook, if you have some questions to talk about, that'd be great. But I hand it over to Topher, Maestro Topher, who's going to give a little talk as well.